That same day, Brian, Cyan, and Alice went out to the academy's garden for a walk. While they were walking calmly, she thought that he had changed quite a bit. She approached him, put her hand on his forehead to measure his height, and with a surprised look, came to the conclusion that now even he was the same height as her and soon he would be even taller than her. Cyan, who was walking next to her, simply started looking at her and remained silent. Cyan closed his eyes and with a pleasant smile, told her that maybe it was she who had shrunk and not him who had grown. Just before he could finish the sentence, Alice grabbed Cyan by the cheek and with a forced smile asked him to stop talking. Today was a beautiful day like any other. The sky was clear and the sun was shining in all its splendor. While Alice was walking beside him, she grabbed her elbow with her hand, slightly turned her head back, closed her eyes and began to smile with joy. Today was July 2nd of the year 988. Cyan remembered this day in his past life as well because it had been the last day he had seen his dear sister Alice alive. While both were walking, she asked him if he was not going to return home, adding that it was already summer vacation. Cyan began to look at her with a sincere gaze, and with a smile explained that no one else except her was going to welcome him there. Upon hearing this, she couldn't help but feel somewhat surprised and confused at the same time. With a puzzled look, she asked him what he meant by nobody. She also asked if this was the reason he hadn't returned home in 2 years. Cyan began to look down at the ground and started to imagine that bastard Ashel. There was more than one reason why he hadn't returned home, and one of them was that Ashel was there. He began to imagine the wife and the Duke. He could not return home since the Duke's wife was trying to kill him at every opportunity she had, and his father turned a blind eye and did nothing about it. Cyan began to remember his home. For him, returning to that place would be an act of suicide. He planned not to return until he graduated. Upon imagining this, Cyan began to look at the ground with a sad expression and remained silently thinking. Alice asked him if he was a good friend of Krantz. While he was looking at the ground, he responded to her that it could never be possible. Upon hearing this, Alice couldn't help but remain in shock and open-mouthed at the same time. With a surprised look, she asked him what he meant by that. Cyan raised his head, started staring at her in the eyes, and reminded her that she herself knew very well how Krantz had treated him. He revealed to her that he had even tried to kill him once. Upon hearing this, Alice's expression changed drastically. She couldn't help but be paralyzed. She couldn't believe what her ears had just heard. Brian, who was behind them, approached, put his hand on his chest, and with a sincere look told her that he could also vouch for it. Alice turned her body to the side, started looking at Brian with a confused look and asked Cyan who he was. He turned around and introduced Brian Kendrick as his guardian knight. Alice put her hand over her mouth and was somewhat surprised. Now she understood why he had been following them. Seeing her expression, Brian was disappointed. He didn't know why she had reacted this way. While the clouds were passing through the sky and time was advancing, Cyan began to explain to Alice everything that had happened. She put her hand under her chin, and while she was looking at the ground, she explained to Cyan that she had been in Fruina, completely unaware of all of it. Cyan, who had his arms crossed, asked her not to worry since it wasn't her fault. According to him, the bad ones were the Duke's wife and Krantz. Brian, who was next to them, simply stayed listening in silence without interrupting. Upon hearing this, Alice's expression changed drastically. Her eyes filled with rage. She couldn't believe that this had really happened. Upon seeing her expression, with a calm look, Cyan caught her attention. Upon hearing his voice, Alice came out of her trance, started looking at him and remained silent. Alice, who had one hand under her chin, put the other on her arm, started looking at Cyan and asked him if he had talked to anyone about this. He closed his eyes and responded to her that everything was in the past. According to him, it didn't make much sense to talk about it. He opened his eyes, and with a calm look he explained to her that Krantz did not seem to be reflecting on his actions. At that moment, she began to extend her hand towards him. She approached him and gave him a hug. Seeing this, Cyan was somewhat confused and surprised at the same time. While a drop of sweat was falling from his cheek, he started looking at her with a confused look and couldn't help but start wondering what was happening. While she was giving Cyan a hug, her eyes filled with tears and sadness, she told him that he didn't need to keep it to himself since sometimes he could count on her. From now on, she decided to take care of protecting him. With a lost look, he started looking at the ground and remained silent. Upon hearing her words, Brian, who was behind them, began to cry, closed his eyes and started wiping the tear with his hand. Alice put both hands on his shoulders, stopped hugging him, moved away a bit, and even though she would like to stay with him longer, she had to go somewhere. She asked him to take care of himself while she was not here. Cyan began to look at her with a surprised look and remained silent. In all his family, she was the only person he could trust. Several seconds later, Brian stopped crying, started looking forward and seeing what was happening. He couldn't help but be in shock. Alice approached him, closed her eyes and with a pleasant smile, gave him a hug and asked him to take good care of little Cyan. Brian got somewhat nervous, started looking at her, and while he was beginning to blush, he asked what she was doing. When looking ahead, he saw Cyan. While his eyes were shining, he started staring at Brian with a murderous look and made the gesture of cutting his throat, warning him that if he did anything with his sister, he was dead. Seeing this, Brian started sweating like crazy and thought that he hadn't done anything. That same day, several hours later, the sun began to set and it started to get dark. Alice's carriage arrived. She approached the academy's exit and started to say goodbye to them using her hand. Brian bowed his head to her as a form of respect and wished her a good trip. Cyan, who was standing next to him, started to say goodbye to her with his hand. With a pleasant smile, he began to recall her expression. It had been a while since he had seen his sister so angry. Several years ago, on a night like any other at the Vert mansion, Cyan was sparring. He had all his clothes worn out and wounds all over his body. Someone attacked him, but he managed to block the attack at the last second. He started looking at the wooden sword, clenched his teeth tightly and thought this was not good. Due to the difference in strength, he fell to the ground. The person who was sparring with him was none other than Krantz. While he had the sword resting on his shoulder, he put his other hand on his waist, started to look at him and was somewhat surprised to see that he was already done. He began to stare intently at Cyan and with a smile asked him to get up, calling him a piece of shit orphan. Cyan entered into a panic, and while he was sweating like crazy, he started to look at Krantz with a gaze full of terror and asked him to stop, adding that he had already won. Krantz began to get tired of so much talk, and just before Cyan could finish speaking, he approached him and using the handle of the wooden sword gave him a strong blow on the cheek, causing his body to be thrown backward. Then, he began to smile, grabbed the sword tightly and started swinging it quickly, giving Cyan a chain of blows. He was enjoying every second of this moment. At that moment, someone appeared and gave Krantz the order to stop. Upon hearing this, his expression changed drastically. He couldn't help but start sweating and thought that this wasn't good. When looking to the side, he saw Alice. With a confused look, he began to wonder what she was doing here. Alice, who had her hands on her hips, approached him and with a serious look asked him what he was doing. With a piercing look, she gave Krantz the order to apologize right now. Back to the present, Cyan went to the royal hall. He sat on the sofa, and while he had one hand resting on his knee, he rested the other on the arm of the sofa and rested his head on his fist. He closed his eyes and with a smile began to remember the past. He had also seen that face once in his past life. He knew that the Duke's house was going to be in an uproar very soon. He opened his eyes and with a serious look thought that Alice needed to know the truth about her family. In his past life, on the battlefield, Alice was surrounded by monsters. She had lost an arm. Her clothes were torn. She was bleeding. But despite this, she grabbed the sword with her other hand and with a look full of determination did not give up. Cyan needed her to know the truth about her family so that in this way he could protect her from the miserable future. While he was deep in his thoughts, someone holding 2 envelopes approached him and caught his attention. This person was Brian. Upon hearing his voice, Cyan snapped out of his trance, started looking at the envelopes, and asked him where he had gotten them from. Brian, who was holding the envelopes, with a serious look explained to him that one envelope was from the academy, and the other envelope he had gotten from some janitor. Upon knowing this, Cyan first took the black envelope. Seeing this, Brian was somewhat surprised. Brian asked him if he wasn't going to take the red envelope. Cyan replied that that envelope was probably from the palace. When looking a little more closely, he realized that Cyan was right since this envelope had the seal of the imperial family. He grabbed the envelope with both hands, started staring at it intently with a curious look and couldn't help but wonder what they had sent. Karam appeared behind them. She peeked over Brian's shoulder, started looking at the envelope with a surprised look and asked them what it was. While she had one hand resting on her waist, she put the other under her chin and began to wonder who had sent these envelopes. Cyan grabbed the envelope with both hands, started to open it, and with a lost look explained to them that they were going to celebrate a banquet around this time of year. Upon opening the black envelope, he saw that there was a black card inside. It didn't take him long to realize that it was an assassination order. The murder of Drenian Nephiles, which had been quite a significant incident that occurred during the palace banquet. He began to look at the card with a serious gaze and remembered that Drenian was the younger brother of the current empress. This incident had been a great shock. While he was lost in his thoughts, Karam, who had her hand resting on her waist, approached him and asked if he was going to attend the banquet. Hearing her voice, Cyan, who was holding the card with one hand, came out of his trance, started looking at her with a calm gaze and replied that yes, adding that he had business there. He began to imagine Sarika touching her glasses and smiling. He remembered that in his past life, someone else had been assigned to this mission. He supposed that Master Hall liked him, which is why she had entrusted this mission to him this time. For him, this was also annoying. Karam approached Brian, took the envelope, and upon looking at it a bit more closely realized that it was from Princess Erin. Cyan, who was looking at the ground, asked her if this was true. She put her hand near her mouth, started laughing, and explained to him that she had thought he was just a little boy. Now she realized that this wasn't true since he had received a love letter. Cyan began to tire of her jokes and used the technique restriction of the demonic sword. Due to this, Karam was paralyzed and fell face first to the ground, breaking it into pieces. Cyan, who was sitting on the sofa, turned his head towards Brian and asked him to make preparations to go to the palace. Brian started sweating and responded with an understood. At that moment, someone entered the royal hall, called Cyan Daddy, and told him she was hungry. Brian started to look to one side, and upon seeing what was in front of his eyes, he couldn't help but stay in shock and open mouth. He asked Cyan to also look. Cyan obeyed him, started to look to one side, and with a confused look asked him what the matter was. Upon seeing what was in front of his eyes, Cyan also remained in shock and couldn't help but start sweating. He didn't know what was happening. The one who had entered the royal hall was none other than Nana. With one hand she was holding a stuffed animal, and with the other she was wiping her eye. She had just woken up from a nap. Compared to before, she had grown. She was no longer a little girl. Her dragon wings were bigger and so were her horns. Cyan couldn't believe that she had grown even more. The next day someone arrived at Vert Mansion, and using all their strength, opened the main door. This person was none other than Alice. Upon opening the door she encountered some servants. Some were maids, others butlers, and others waiters. All were surprised to see her. The head butler, who wore glasses, turned his head towards her and couldn't help but be surprised to see that she had arrived. She clenched both fists, began to stare intently at the butler with a look full of hatred, and asked him where the Duchess was. The Duchess was in the main hall. She was sitting on the sofa and reading a book and drinking coffee. Upon hearing the commotion, she began to look towards the door with a confused look and couldn't help but start wondering what was happening. Alice opened the door forcefully, and as she was slowly approaching her, she started to look at the ground. Upon seeing her, the Duchess was surprised. While a drop of sweat was falling from her cheek, she asked Alice how she had been. Just before she could finish the sentence, Alice extended her hand to one side, started staring at her with a look full of hatred, and without hesitating for even a second gave her a strong slap in the face. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.